All right, let's dive in. We're talking about a huge topic today, one that shapes how millions of people think about the end of the world. It's called dispensationalism, and we're going to tackle a pretty explosive claim about where it actually came from. So here's the big question we're wrestling with. Did this whole way of looking at the end times just pop up out of nowhere in the 1800s? Or could it actually have roots that stretch all the way back to the very first Christians? Now, the common argument against it is pretty straightforward. You hear it all the time. Theologian Millard Erickson puts it bluntly here. No trace of this can be found in the early history of the church. It's often treated like case closed, you know? But that's the very thing we're going to put under the microscope today.
All right, so let's start by digging into that claim, the idea that this is all a pretty new thing. Before we can see the other side, we've got to understand exactly what this modern origin theory says.
Okay, so the story usually goes like this. There's this one guy, John Nelson Darby, back in the 1800s. Critics say he basically invented the whole system. Then it got super popular because of something called the Schofield Reference Bible. The main point they're making is crystal clear. This way of thinking has zero connection to the early church. And look, this isn't some weird fringe idea. This is what a lot of people are taught in schools and online right now. But wait a second, if we're going to go hunting for this idea in ancient history, we need to know what we're actually looking for, right? So let's nail down a quick definition. What is dispensationalism really?
Basically, think of it as a specific lens for reading the Bible. It really boils down to three big ideas. First, you take scripture literally whenever you can. Second, you see all of human history divided up into these different periods or dispensations. And third, and this is a big one, it keeps God's plan for Israel separate from his plan for the church. And here's what those different periods look like. The whole system maps out 7 of them. It kicks off with innocence, think Garden of Eden, and moves all the way through history, through the time of the law with Moses, right up to where we are now, the age of grace. And the grand finale? A literal 1,000-year kingdom right here on earth. The idea is that in each of these eras, God was working with humanity in a slightly different way. And this is really the key to the whole thing. The entire system is built on that one principle, reading the Bible literally. So if a prophecy mentions a 1,000-year kingdom on earth, a dispensationalist is going to say, yep, that means a literal 1,000-year kingdom on this earth. It's not just some nice spiritual metaphor. Okay, so now that we know what we're looking for, let's do some digging. Let's go back in time and listen to some voices from the past. What did the folks who lived right after the apostles, the early church, what did they have to say about all this? And right away, we hit something that directly challenges that whole modern invention idea. The sources we're looking at point to research showing that a belief in a future, literal, 1,000-year reign of Christ, they call it premillennialism, wasn't just some wacky fringe theory. Nope. For the first 300 years of the church, it was actually the main view. Just look at this quote from Irenaeus. He's a major church leader from the 2nd century, and he lays it out pretty clearly. Listen to what he says. He talks about 2 things, a future tribulation that's going to be awful, and then the church being suddenly caught up out of it. Does that ring any bells? So why is a guy like Irenaeus so important? Well, check out his resume. This wasn't some random dude writing centuries later. He was taught by a guy named Polycarp. And Polycarp, he was a disciple of the Apostle John. The Apostle John. That's an incredibly close connection. We're talking one person away from an eyewitness. Okay, but this brings up a massive question, doesn't it? If this stuff was so common in the early church, where did it go? Why does it feel like it just vanished for like 1,500 years, only to show up again in the 1800s? Well, the argument is that there was this huge fundamental shift in how people started reading the Bible. You had the early church, which took things very literally, but over time, a different approach, an allegorical one, took over. Thinkers like Origin and later Augustine became really influential, and they started teaching that all those prophecies about a future kingdom weren't about a literal place on earth, but were actually spiritual metaphors about the church. And it wasn't a small change. To back this up, look at what Paul Benware says. He claims that before Augustine and this big allegorical shift, the premillennial, literal view was, and I'm quoting here, virtually the only view to be found. That's a huge statement. The new way of reading things became so dominant that the old way just kind of faded away for a really long time. So, there you have it. That's the explanation for the 1,500-year gap. And this brings us right to the main point of this whole argument. It completely reframes the debate. Maybe it's not a new invention at all. Maybe it's an old idea that just got a new lease on life. So the big takeaway is this. The argument presented here is that dispensationalism wasn't invented by John Nelson Darby in the 1800s. It was recovered. The idea is that Darby and others didn't invent anything new. They were more like theological archaeologists who uncovered something ancient that had been buried for centuries under layers of allegorical interpretation. So when we put it all together, the claim is that the core building blocks, the idea of a future tribulation, the church being caught up before it, a real 1,000-year kingdom, and that key distinction between Israel and the church, you can find footprints of all these ideas way back in the first few centuries after Christ.
And that leaves us with a pretty wild thought to chew on. If a major belief, something that was once the main view, could just disappear from the scene for more than a millennium, well, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other ancient ideas might be out there, just sitting in old texts, waiting for someone to rediscover them?